Hey Creative Cats! Through creative conversations, we look at topics to help creatives like you make stuff that matters. In this video, let's take a look at reviewing Zadie Smith's latest book, Intimations. I'm curious, have you read this book yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Otherwise, why don't we just move right on up? Intimations is a series of 6 different essays written with Smith's characteristic clarity and insight on the topics of COVID-19, time, habit, suffering, racism, and life lessons. The book itself is inspired in part by 2 different books that Smith happened to pick up while she was in a friend's library. The first is a book by the art critic John Berger titled Photocopies. She said that she was inspired from that book for its encounters with people. Photocopies has also been described as a collection of moments, and it's really easy to see that connection with Smith's work because it feels like 6 different encounters with the pandemic and people filtered through the unique lens that the pandemic brings. Now, the second book that Smith is inspired by is Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And she even quotes a passage from Meditations saying, "No rule is better suited for philosophy than the one you happen to be in right now." She admits to consulting Meditations during the pandemic for its practical advice. And practicality is a theme that comes up in this book time and time again. When considering why she writes, she says, simply, it's something to do. Like baking banana bread or making a living room fort during the pandemic. In this book, Smith seems very concerned about time and what we do with it, our clumsy habits and way of structuring our routines. Do we know how to stop? She asks, and eventually settles on a quote by Ottessa Moshfegh that says, "Without love, life is just doing time." For Smith, love, like art, is an experience to actually go through, to be put through. However, she does acknowledge art's specific limitation on political revolution, especially next to something like direct action. In the essay, she also continues to explore why she writes, and here she settles on controlling experience. She even calls the writing department the controlling experience department. And on the topic of controlling experience, Smith says that America must finally face death directly, despite its long-held tendency to avoid, displace, or prolong it. Smith compares the situation to post-war Europe that was exhausted by death and eventually decided that public health was not something to be made of by private interest. And death is undeniably linked with suffering. But in comparison to something like privilege, which is a conversation that's been popular as of late, privilege is something that we compare ourselves with to others and is relative in that way. But it's something that we can do something about. Suffering, Zadie Smith says, is different. Suffering applies itself directly to the suffering individual and cannot be mediated by a third term like privilege, she says. Smith is absolutely astute here and continues, suffering applies itself directly to its subject and will not be shamed out of itself or eradicated by a righteous argument. COVID-19 sees us suffer in our idiosyncratic ways, even if we might roll our eyes at how our wealthy aunt, unable to go on her vacation, defines suffering. Next, screen grabs, which is the section that is named after Berger's Photocopies. It is a set of 7 different scenes and is, in my opinion, the strongest section of the book for how it weaves interactions with people with the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, Zadie Smith talks about how each teaching semester she starts off with a quote by Susan Sontag, which is, "A style is a means of insisting on something." With that, she connects that quote to Cy, a young, energetic IT man who travels on a hoverboard. She captures his youthful and exuberant energy and compares it to Carlton from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. From there, she ends the screen grab by saying, "The style of Cy, the style of all young people, now radically interrupted." Judging by Goodreads, many readers' favorite part of this book is an essay titled Postscript, Contempt as a Virus, which is an essay that touches on racism, the death of George Floyd, and conceptualizes contempt as a virus. She says it starts by affecting individuals and goes on to affect nations. Towards the end of the essay, she says she's not quite convinced that awareness alone is enough to eradicate contempt. The final section, Intimations, is an endearing yet sometimes clumsy emulation of Marcus Aurelius's aphorisms and meditations. To be fair, I don't know how anyone would ever live up to that book, but some sections read a little bit too formulaic for my personal taste. For example, in section number 10, she ends that passage by saying, therefore solidarity, and then in section number 15, she ends that passage by saying, therefore liberty. Now, there are some sections that are quite endearing, and I'll read you a quote from there. But the task is in front of you. Delight in it. The more absurd and tiny it is, the more care and dedication it deserves. Large, sensible ideas require far less belief. In an article for Vox, Constance Grady suggests that the strongest sections of this book are on the utility of writing. While interesting, I personally disagree and find those sections to be peculiar to the author. After all, as Smith herself points out, authors find a lot of convoluted, more or less self-regarding reasons and explanations for why they write. I don't think that Smith is exempt here. After all, having something to do is not more or less immediate. As essential workers bag groceries, Smith writes. In contrast, I think that the strongest sections of this book are her screen grabs, because the way she writes them illustrates how important encounters with others become and how more relevant they become in periods of lockdown. Here, Smith's writing is intimate while being relatable and outward-facing. On occasion, Smith pulls her reader out of the reader experience by self-reflexivity. For example, there's a section where she says, the police are investigating a murder as a hate crime always prompts in me the query, when it comes to murder, what other crime is there? I realize that's banal, but I can't help it. Here, I can't help but think that the only thing that makes it banal is Smith saying it. Smith continues this self-reflexivity throughout the book. But it is the upper limit of what I seem to dislike about this book, because after all, it is a clear and timely set of lessons to take from such an unprecedented time. As a bonus, if you're interested in this book, the funds from it go to the Equal Justice Initiative as well as the COVID-19 Emergency Relief Fund. But what about you? What do you think? Have you yourself read Intimations? What did you think about it? If you haven't, what parts of the book pique your interest the most? I'd love to hear in the comments below. So join the conversation. As always, my name is Sarah. If you'd like to keep participating in these creative conversations, consider subscribing. And until next time, keep making stuff that matters. In a review for... Whoa, my cat just jumped on the TV.